All right. So as a quick continuation of my previous video, we are going to be looking at some additional functions that are really helpful when you are doing Excel cleaning. And these are almost always going to be used in a if function because they're usually logical tests. But I'm just going to walk you through each of these and kind of show you how they work. So for instance, the OR function is just looking at a bunch of different arguments and determining whether all of those, or whether at least one of those arguments is true, or whether all of those arguments are false. So you can think of this as, is this true or is this true? And if one of those is true, then it'll output a true value. So let's write this out. So we're going to write OR, and then it's going to ask us for our first logical question. So in this case, I'm going to look at, is a single one of these above 18? In which case it should be true. But we're also going to ask it whether that same range is, if anything there is below 2. And once we hit enter, since the first statement was true, it already knows that it's going to be true. However, for this next, for this next one, there is nothing here that is above 18 or below 2. So it's going to return a false, since all statements in there are false. So an OR function looks for if anything is true. Meanwhile, AND functions are going to function in the opposite way, where it's going to look at if all contained tests are true. And if even one of them is not true, it'll return a false. But let me show you how we could use this in a, well, I guess I've got it demonstrated here. So in the case of an if function, if we put this OR function at the very beginning, it's going to either return a true or false for the data. And then, based on what that OR function says, it'll output one of these two different equations. So here's what I'm going to do. It's a little bootleg, but we're going to put that in. We're going to get rid of that end quote so it activates the equation, except it's looking at the wrong range of data. For some reason, it's looking up there. So let's redirect it, and we are going to tell it, look right here. And then we are going to delete this one, and we are also going to tell it to look right there. Okay, it doesn't like my function, and that's because this is missing a parenthesis or a quotation, which I don't know why, but now it works, and we can drag. Perfect. Okay, so same thing with an AND function. It's going to function much the same way, except it's going to make sure that every single one of the arguments is true. So in this case, if we write AND, it's going to ask us to, again, evaluate, all right, is every single one of these, or is there any of this data that's above 18? And if that's true, it's going to also look at if any of that data is below 2. And as we know, some of the data is below 2, some of it's above 18, so this should return a true. However, why is it not? AND functions can be a little finicky. So let's make sure we've got everything here right. So we're looking for if anything's below 2 and anything is above. Maybe we just need to put a space there. Let me do some editing off camera. All right, I figured it out. The issue is that I had conflicting statements. So before I had kind of the same structure up here where things are above 18 or below 2, but you can't have that in an AND statement because each cell has to fulfill everything. So in this case, I've now replaced it with this function called isNumber, which just looks at, is this cell a number? And what we'll be able to do then is if we're looking at everything above 18, it looks at this entire row and it checks each cell and says, okay, each of these is above 18 and each of these is a number. So everything checks out. However, if some of it is not under 18, even though each of these is a number, it's still going to return a false. Okay, now we've got that over with, let's do a count function. A count function just allows us to see where our numbers are. So we are going to do count, and then we are just going to highlight this whole area, and you'll notice that there are 2 numbers but a bunch of letters. It only counts the numbers. There is a different function for text, but I have found that the number one works the easiest. We can easily integrate that into a function where we just ask it and say, okay, is there at least 3 numbers here? Otherwise, we don't want to calculate anything. And if so, then we have it output certain text. We can also have Excel identify whether a cell is text. So it can look at this cell and say, yeah, this is text. But once it hits a number, it will say it is not text. Now, this gets a little complicated because sometimes you can format a number cell as text, but almost always it will be that numbers are numbers and text is text. And sometimes you just need this to validate that you can calculate something. So for instance, if I was trying to run a function where I'm multiplying this cell by 5, it's going to say value. Like, I can't do that. But if we had this function set up where we have it first check and say, all right, is this text? And if so, just say you can't calculate it. But otherwise, then you can run it. So there's some utility there. The final function I'm going to show you is the absolute value function. And this is often the case that we use or when we're deriving certain movement scores or deviations from the mean. We sometimes aren't so worried about which direction it's going, rather that it's deviating from 0. And in that case, we just need data that reflects that. So we can use an absolute value to return. In this case, the absolute value of 1 is 1, but it'll reverse all of those negatives into positives. So super easy stuff. The other 2 helpful tricks I'm going to show you have to do with replacing data. And what that means is sometimes you have data that is not what it's supposed to be. Maybe you've got a bunch of data that looks like this, and you just want to get rid of all of it. There's 2 things I'm going to highlight with this. First is just the replace function. So to use the replace function, we're going to highlight the area that we want to replace things in, and then we're going to hit Control and then F, and it's going to bring up this dialog box. And we are going to tab over to the Replace tab. And in this tab, we will have a Find What and then Replace With box. And in here, we can tell it, all right, I want you to find this thing, and I want you to put this there. And you can use this a few different ways. You can use this to find blanks and replace it with numbers. So in this case, if we wanted to replace every blank in this area with 77, we could then hit Replace All. The other thing, though, before we run that, is we have to understand what the difference is between Match Case and Match Entire Cell Contents. In some cases, you have things contained within a cell that are not the entirety of that cell. In this case, we've got 1001, so 1001. But if we are targeting zeros and we want to replace it with Jonah, if we do match case, it is going to find every instance of 0 and replace it with Jonah. So if we hit Replace All, you see now in that cell we have 1 Jonah Jonah 1, which is not what we want. So I'm going to hit Control Z. Instead, what we can do is we can target the cells where 0 is the only thing in there. And in that case, we want to use the Match Entire Cell Contents. So in this case, it's going to ignore that one, but replace all the ones where 0 is the only thing. And if we're doing something like replacing blanks with Jonah, that becomes important because we need to look at the cells where there's only blank. So if we hit Replace, that's great. If we want to get rid of all instances of Jonah now, we can then replace with a blank. And that's perfect. Okay, and then building on this, sometimes we need to delete areas or select areas that are blanks. And this will come into our example where we need to get rid of like blank rows. So what we're going to do is we are going to use the find and select function. So we're going to highlight this area. We're going to go to find and select, and we're going to go to special. And in here, there's an item called blanks. We're going to click that, and you'll note that it selects every single one of those blanks. And what that'll allow us to do is we'll then be able to right click, hit delete, and then it'll allow us to shift our data one way or another. So for instance, if this all is error and we want this all shifted up, we can shift all cells up. And now we don't have any gaps in our data. That's going to be a big thing for the test. All right, so that's the end of this video. If you feel like you're ready, go in here and try to complete all of these objectives here with this data down under. I will have one more video where I talk about how I would go about doing this, but there's not just one way to do this. Also, I'm noticing there is a typo there, but whatever. No one's paying me to spell. And make sure you check out that key or the video if you have questions.